I still can't believe we went through with it. It started as a joke, one of Jake's stupid dares. He'd always been the fearless one, dragging Danny and me into his schemes like we were sidekicks in his personal adventure movie. But that night at the abandoned carnival was different. That night, we weren't heroes. We were prey. The place had been abandoned for years, sitting just outside of town like a skeleton in the dark. The rusted gates creaked as we pushed them open, their groans swallowed by the wind. The carnival grounds were a wasteland of shattered rides and faded banners, the smell of mildew hanging in the air. Somewhere, a loose piece of metal clanged, making Danny flinch. "Relax," Jake said, flashing his cocky grin. "It's just the wind." "Or a ghost," I muttered under my breath. Danny shot me a look, her wide eyes silently begging me not to make this worse. Jake led the way, flashlight in hand, his confidence unshaken as we crossed the overgrown grounds toward the funhouse. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its garish paint peeling like a snake, shedding its skin. The once cheerful face of a clown was cracked and weathered above the entrance, its grin twisted into something that felt more like a warning. "Here we are," Jake announced, kicking aside a broken board. "Home of Patches, the laughing spirit." "Let's just go home," Danny whispered. "This place gives me the creeps." Jake rolled his eyes. "Come on, Danny. It's just an old story. Besides, Lily's not scared, are you?" I wanted to say I wasn't, to shrug it off like I always did when Jake teased me. But my throat was dry, and the words stuck there like glue. Instead, I stepped forward, pretending my legs weren't shaking. "Let's get this over with," I said. Inside, the air was damp and stifling, heavy with the scent of mold and rot. Our footsteps echoed eerily as we ventured deeper, the beams from our flashlights slicing through the thick shadows. The mirrors were shattered or clouded with grime, but some still caught fragments of our reflections, twisting them into grotesque shapes. My own face stared back at me from one jagged shard, warped into a monstrous grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "This is the spot," Jake announced, stopping in a room where the graffiti on the walls seemed almost deliberate. The words "call him" were scrawled in jagged red letters above an arrow pointing to a cracked mirror and a dusty, moth-eaten clown hat. "Are you serious?" Danny asked, her voice shaking. "This is so stupid." "Scared," Jake taunted, picking up the hat and tossing it to me. I caught it reluctantly, the fabric coarse and cold in my hands. "It's just a story," I muttered, more to myself than to Danny. "Let's just do it and get out of here." Jake grinned and gestured for us to sit. We formed a loose circle around the mirror, the hat resting on its surface. Jake took out his phone, reading aloud from a website he'd found about the legend of Patches. "To summon the spirit, place an offering, a token of laughter, at the heart of the funhouse," he read. "Speak his name thrice, and he will appear." "Token of laughter?" Danny asked. Jake shrugged and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small novelty clown nose. "Brought it just in case," he said with a wink, placing it beside the hat. "All right, let's do this," Jake said, his voice mockingly serious. "Patches, patches, patches." At first, nothing happened. The silence was suffocating, the air so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft chuckle, high-pitched and unnatural. "Did you hear that?" Danny whispered, clutching my arm. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls. The mirrors around us began to shimmer, the reflections shifting in ways they shouldn't. My own face twisted and stretched, the grin growing impossibly wide. This isn't funny, Jake," I said, my voice trembling. Jake's cocky smirk faltered. "It's just special effects or something," he said, though even he sounded uncertain. The room began to spin, the walls warping and twisting like a funhouse ride gone wrong. The mirrors expanded, their surfaces rippling like water. I reached for Danny, but my hand passed through her, as though she were smoke. "Lily!" she screamed, her voice distorted and distant. I turned, but Jake was gone, replaced by a puppet-like figure with hollow eyes and a painted smile. "Run!" Danny's voice broke through the chaos. I stumbled toward her, the room stretching endlessly ahead of me. No matter how far I ran, the exit never came closer. Laughter surrounded me, cruel and mocking, as if the funhouse itself were alive. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was running. The next, I was outside, gasping for air as the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon. I turned, expecting to see Jake and Danny behind me. But they weren't there. Jake? Danny. I called, my voice hoarse. The funhouse was silent now, its twisted laughter replaced by an eerie stillness. I stepped closer, peering into the dirty glass of one of the mirrors still intact outside. My blood ran cold. Jake and Danny stared back at me, their faces warped into grotesque caricatures, their eyes pleading as they pounded soundlessly against the glass. "Help us," Jake mouthed, his painted smile betraying the terror in his eyes. I screamed and stumbled back, tripping over the cracked pavement. The funhouse creaked and groaned as though mocking me. I ran, tears streaming down my face, the faint sound of laughter following me all the way home. The carnival burned down a week later. No one knows how the fire started, but locals say you can still hear faint laughter at night, carried on the wind. I haven't been back to the ruins since. Sometimes, though, when I look into a mirror, I catch a glimpse of Jake or Danny, their hollow eyes staring back at me, begging for release. And sometimes late at night, I hear it, that soft, high-pitched chuckle, reminding me that the funhouse may be gone, but Patches is still watching. They say curiosity killed a cat, but I've never thought much about old sayings. That night at Harborview Lighthouse, however, I learned just how true they could be. It started with Zoe, always the daring one, convincing Mark and me to check out the lighthouse. "You guys are so boring," she teased, grinning as she twirled her flashlight in the dark. "Come on, we'll make a story worth telling." Mark shrugged, his usual response to Zoe's antics, while I, against my better judgment, agreed. Harborview has stood abandoned for decades, its silhouette jagged against the coastline like some broken tooth. Stories about the place were as constant as the tides, the mysterious disappearance of the last keeper, strange lights at night, voices carried on the wind. And yet, there we were, 3 college kids armed with bravado and a lack of common sense. The hike to the lighthouse wasn't easy. The path was overgrown, the air heavy with salt and dampness. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, and the crashing waves below added a constant roar to the eerie silence around us. By the time we reached the rusted gate, I was already regretting the decision. "This is so cool," Zoe said, pushing open the gate with a creak that made my skin crawl. The lighthouse loomed above us, its beacon long extinguished. Inside, the air was colder, damp, and thick with the scent of mildew. Mark muttered something about asbestos, but Zoe waved him off, her flashlight darting across graffiti-covered walls. "That's it," she said, pointing at a faded sketch of a lantern surrounded by what looked like instructions. "It's a summoning ritual." "You've got to be kidding me," I said, already uneasy. Zoe wasn't kidding. She found a lantern among the debris, its glass cracked but otherwise intact. "It's perfect," she said, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. Mark hesitated. "Are you sure about this, Zoe? I mean, it's just a stupid story, but—" "Oh, come on," she replied, setting the lantern on a dusty table. "What's the worst that could happen? The ghost of the lighthouse keeper shows up? Ooh!" She wiggled her fingers mockingly. Despite my protests, she lit the lantern, muttering the words scrawled on the wall. I didn't understand them, but they sounded old, almost alive. The flame flickered unnaturally, growing brighter and dimmer in rapid succession. The air turned dense, carrying the sharp tang of salt. Then a low hum filled the room, reverberating through the walls. "Zoe, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. A booming voice echoed around us, deep and guttural. "You've lit my path. Now join me." The lantern's light flared violently, bathing the room in a blinding glow. Zoe's laughter turned to a scream as an invisible force pulled her toward the light. I lunged for her, but my hands passed right through her. She wasn't solid anymore, her form dissolving into strands of light that twisted and flowed into the beacon above. "Zoe!" Mark shouted, stumbling backward. His flashlight clattered to the floor, the beam jerking wildly. Then silence. The lantern's flame burned steady now, unnaturally bright. Zoe was gone. Mark and I stood there, frozen, too shocked to speak. The hum of the lantern was the only sound, low and insidious, like a heartbeat. I don't remember how we got out of the lighthouse, only that we ran until our legs gave out. We didn't stop to look back, didn't try to explain what had happened. It wasn't until we were safely in Mark's car, the engine sputtering to life, that I realized I was clutching Zoe's flashlight. We called the authorities the next morning. They found the lantern still burning, its light visible even in the midday sun. But there was no sign of Zoe. Not then. Not ever. People say the light flickers when her name is spoken, that her laughter can be heard on quiet nights when the wind is still. Mark refuses to talk about that night, and I can't blame him. The memory clings to me like the salt in the air that surrounded us. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of her face caught in the glow of that unnatural light. And when I wake, I swear I can hear her voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering from the distance. You've lit my path. Now join me